interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
This is not a drill. This is an emergency.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent.
I'm Tommy Salmons. This is Year Zero.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Today, the Taliban claimed responsibility for killing 2 American service members in Afghanistan. Leaders as disparate as President Obama and President Trump have both said that they want to end U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, but it isn't over for America. Why isn't it over? Why can't presidents of very different parties and very different temperaments get us out of there? And how could you?
I appreciate that question. So I've been in Congress 17 years. And 12 of those years, I've sat on the Armed Services Committee, either the Defense Appropriations Committee or the Armed Services Committee. And the lesson that I've learned over the years is that you have to stay engaged in these situations. Nobody likes it. It's long. It's tedious. But right now we have, so I would say we must be engaged in this. We must have our State Department engaged. We must have our military engaged to the extent they need to be. But the reality of it is this president doesn't even have people appointed in the State Department to deal with these things. Whether we're talking about Central America, whether we're talking about Iran, whether we're talking about Afghanistan, we've got to be completely engaged. And here's why. Because these flare-ups distract us from the real problems in the country. If getting drones shot down for $130 million because the president is distracted, that's $130 million that we could be spending in places like Youngstown, Ohio, or Flint, Michigan, or rebuilding.
Congresswoman Gabbard, I'm going to give you 30 seconds, actually, to jump off what he said. He described engagement as the problem. Is that what you will tell
the parents of those 2 soldiers who were just killed in Afghanistan? Well, we just have to be engaged. As a soldier, I will tell you that answer is unacceptable. We have to bring our troops home from Afghanistan. We are in a place in Afghanistan where we have lost so many lives. We've spent so much money, money that's coming out of every one of our pockets, money that should be going into communities here at home, meeting the needs of the people here at home. We are no better off in Afghanistan today than we were when this war began. This is why it's so important to have a president and commander-in-chief who knows the cost of war and who's ready to do the job on day one. I am ready to do that job when I walk into the Oval Office. Thank you very much.
Listen, I'm going to go down the line. I'm going to go down the line here. Well, you know what? You felt like she was responding. You get 30 seconds. Go.
Good man.
Fair enough.
I appreciate that.
I hear what you're saying.
I would just say I don't want to be engaged. I wish we were spending all this money in places that I've represented that have been completely forgotten and we were rebuilding. But the reality of it is, if the United States isn't engaged, the Taliban will grow and they will have bigger, bolder terrorist acts. We have got to have some present there. The
Taliban was there long before we came in. They'll be there long before we leave.
Well,
we cannot keep U.S. troops deployed to Afghanistan thinking that we're going to somehow squash this Taliban that has been there, that every other country that's tried has failed.
I didn't say squash them. When we weren't in there, they started flying planes into our buildings. So I'm just saying right now,
the Taliban didn't attack us on 9/11. Al-Qaeda did.
Well, I understand.
Al-Qaeda attacked us on 9/11.
I understand.
That's why I and so many other people joined the military to go after Al-Qaeda, not the Taliban.
The Taliban was protecting those people who were plotting against us. All I'm saying is, if we want to go into elections and we want to say that we got to withdraw from the world, that's what President Trump is saying. We can't. I would love for us to.
Who's protecting Al-Qaeda right now in Saudi Arabia?
Well, okay. So that moment there with between Tulsi Gabbard and Tim Ryan, that was the best moment of the entire 4 hours of debates in for the Democratic debates this last week. Tulsi Gabbard did a good job of holding her ground. I thought she backed off a little bit further, and I'll get into that here in a second. But that was probably, you know, it's I'm not going to put it up there with a Ron Paul style of moment whenever he faced off with Giuliani, just because number one, Tim Ryan's not nearly well as known as Rudy Giuliani was. Tulsi Gabbard, by my estimation, is better well known than Tim Ryan. But it was a good moment for her to shine and to show that if you confront her, or you get into it with her about the foreign policy, she's going to chew you up and spit you out, especially any of the Democrats in this debate. The main problem, like, I really had with this whole thing is, number one, Tim Ryan, he goes on to talk about, like, he was talking about how he was a member of the Armed Services Committee, and now he wants to be the president of the United States, be in charge of foreign policy. But he doesn't even understand the basics of what's going on. And he's confusing, and I hear people do this all the time, confusing the Taliban with Al-Qaeda, and they're not one and the same. And he went on to say, well, they were protecting Al-Qaeda. And this is where I think Tulsi messed up. Okay. So as soon as he said, well, they were protecting Al-Qaeda, all Tulsi Gabbard had to say, well, actually, if you remember correctly, the Taliban was actually attempting to negotiate extradition of Al-Qaeda members to the United States, but George W. Bush wanted war so badly, he refused to get his hands on the perpetrators of 9/11 immediately, with the assistance of the Taliban. And he decided to go to war, and then he started fighting against the Taliban as well as Al-Qaeda, even though the Taliban had nothing to do with the terrorist attack on September 11th. And the fact that we're over there and we have men and women over there fighting against the Taliban today, while the Taliban has put terms on the table saying, hey, look, we can negotiate here if you will just back off and let's have some negotiations. And I know some have taken place. I'm not sure how far the negotiations have gotten. I haven't really kept up with that. I haven't really seen much about that in the last few months, but I do know that they have sat down and talked. And that's what should be happening, is we should be, the U.S. government should be sitting down with the Taliban and saying, okay, let's negotiate some kind of peace here, because this is ridiculous. We've gotten our men and women are in a situation to where they're going to continue to die, and there's going to continue to be innocent people killed. So let's get our troops out of there. Let's see what y'all have to offer, and let's move forward. And that would be the best way to go about it. But the fact of the matter is, the U.S. cannot admit defeat, just like they could not admit defeat in Vietnam. They're not going to be able to admit defeat in Afghanistan, and you're going to have a hard time finding a president that's willing to pull the troops out and say, you know what, this is a major scar on the record of the military and of those that were dictating these policies ever since George W. Bush. And I know a lot of people thought Trump was that guy, but Trump's not that guy, because he doesn't have the knowledge, he doesn't have the literacy in geopolitics to understand what it takes to do this in such a way. When you have all these military members, you have, the CIA and all these guys in his ear saying, no. This, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. But he doesn't have the knowledge and the wherewithal to stand up against those guys and say, no, this is what I know to be true. And this is what you people need to accept, is that we're not going to be over there perpetually fighting these perpetual wars, these forever wars, and continuing to get men and women, innocent civilians, killed, no matter what country that's in. And he just doesn't have that. He's all talk and no play when it comes to this situation, because he doesn't understand foreign policy. And that's a really good thing about Tulsi Gabbard. Now, I don't believe for a second she's actually going to be the party's nominee, but it was good to see that moment. if you watch the entire 4 hours, the 2 nights of debates, 2 hours the first night, 2 hours second night, 10 candidates the first night, 10 candidates the second night. It's the rest of it is pretty blasé. I mean, it's boring. It's pretty much what you expect. There was a little bit of going after Joe Biden by Kamala Harris. Nothing over the top. But for the most part, it was just kind of like, all right, whatever. You get what you expect. You get a whole lot of people making a lot of promises. When I'm in government, we're going to take care of you. We're going to give you a job. We're going to make sure that you never have to worry. So the hubris it takes to believe that you have the answers to solve everyone's problems. Like, you have the ability to ensure jobs, comfort, sufficient health care, safety, retirement, all around security to 350 million people or whatever the country is up to nowadays. That's, I don't know. It's just crazy. These people believe they have the power to alter the environment and remove the dangers associated with living, with life in general. The paternalism involved is absolutely dumbfounding. And for grown men, grown women, adults all around to buy into the idea that people can do this in any efficient and effective way just blows my damn mind. Yeah, I understand being paternal as a parent. I understand. I have a certain role or an instinct when it comes to my children. I want them to be safe. I want success for them. But they're entering adulthood now. So am I just supposed to continue to do for them and try to negate all obstacles that may be in their way? Or do I try to shift and evolve into another role in their lives? One of support when needed, of advice when asked for, but non-intrusive, kind of hands off. Let adults be adults. Encourage them when they need it, but I don't know, man. They're gonna fail. They're gonna get hurt. They're gonna struggle. But the failures, pains, and struggles are theirs to conquer. This is how you build character. This is how you learn to succeed. This is how you learn to move forward and beyond obstacles that are in your way. This is how you grow. This understanding, this unspoken contract formulated by responsibility of bringing life into the world, this understanding that a child enters the world helpless, unable to fend for themselves. They must be fed, clothed, and sheltered. They must be taught even the simplest of things. Like, you have to be taught how to chew. You have to be taught how to ride a bike, or how to walk, or how to talk. You have to be taught all these things. And why are you teaching them these things? You're not teaching them these things so that you can continuously pamper them and breastfeed them throughout their entire lives. You're teaching them these things so that they can grow and be self-sufficient, so that they can get out from under your thumb, so that they can be out from under your shadows, so that you don't have to nurture them their entire lives. They'll they grow up to be capable of living without an overseer, without somebody standing over them, micromanaging their every move, and making sure they hold their hand and don't allow them to do anything that might be harmful to them or their future. The fact of the matter is, people are going to make mistakes. Life is full of these mistakes. It's full of these errors. It's full of these struggles. And that's part of it. That's just part of life. And to think and act, you want them to think and act in ways that benefit them. For you to think or to act as if you can continuously, guide or control their environment in those aspects of their life around them is completely naive. You're training them to get out, to act in their best self-interest and the best self-interest of the family that they create. The lives they bring into the world are their responsibility, not your responsibility. Though, I mean, I'm certain that grandparents feel a certain responsibility for their grandchildren, but it's not the same as a parent and their child. It's separated, by a dimension. Therefore, there's a hands-off approach to it, and it's a little easier to see from the outside looking in. Hey, maybe like you need to let that child fail in this area. You need to let them, struggle at times. This idea that maybe like you're supposed to be hands-on throughout the life of your children, that's what the promise of politics is. That's that continuous paternalist view in which they come and they coddle. In this case, the parents are free to abandon responsibility as the state steps in to manage their children and to care for their children. And that's giving the parents an out. The parents took on this responsibility of bringing life into this world, and they are ultimately responsible for, making sure that life is best prepared for this. And whenever you're giving them that cushion to say, no, you know what, I would rather not be involved in this facet of the life. I'm going to allow the government to teach sex education. Therefore, I don't have to have that uncomfortable conversation with my child. Or I'm going to let the government control their education moving forward. Therefore, I don't have the burden and responsibility of ensuring that my child is well educated. When you look at it in that aspect, you've abdicated all your responsibility in your adulthood. You've given up your self-sufficiency in favor of state-provided essentials. You're coddled. You're meant to remain in a position of suspended youth, abandoning your individuality to become this member of a societal group or a societal family, this organization that has completely grabbed on to the coattails of the government and allowing the government to make these basic decisions for them. You've chosen to be a dependent as opposed to independent. And the state's entire goal is to mold you and shape you until their ideal benefactor. So just as you keep your 6-year-old away from the street to preserve and protect them, to raise them and to make sure that they're safe and not putting themselves in unnecessary danger, the state disciplines you for acting in ways that could cause harm to you, whether it would be, drinking or drugs or prostitution or any number of things that have been illegal over the years and been prohibited over the years. The state is attempting to manage you and to control you and to create and put you in the situation that they want you to be in that is best for their interest, as if you're incapable of the simplest of decisions. Like, you need to be guided to their ends because their ends is more noble than any decisions or any goals or ambitions that you may have. To be part of their ideal society is what you should be pursuing, and not your own individual independent ideal or free thinking, curiosity. It should all be managed and guided within this influence that the state has created in order to keep you lazy, in order for you to not have to be uncomfortable. And they convince you that this is for your own safety, this is for your own security, and when in all actuality, this is for their benefit. And when you get into these conversations, I don't know. It's like, while the process of Republicans and Democrats fighting over which will be a better mother for the people, I guess is the best way to say it. Which one's going to be the better parent? Which one's better at nurturing throughout a life, and not just into adulthood, but until the death of you? Which one is better? And there's this use of these euphemisms in fighting over this in this battle, and it drives me crazy. Like, you hear like national security, because they'll use that in many instances whenever they feel like information may be embarrassing to the state or to their bureaucracies. But one of the ones that you hear all the time that I want to kind of talk about just a few minutes here, and I want to kind of point this out because I think it's very interesting. But one of the ones, and you hear this, I heard this a couple of times through the Democratic debates, and you can't be engaged in any political thought or any political like investigation or study without hearing the word justice. And just as an example, I was in a conversation the other day with a guy, and we were talking about putting the arming of poor minorities in the inner cities, and he kept bringing up the word justice. He kept, well, is this gonna bring about justice if these people are armed and they're attempting to defend themselves, whether it's against perpetrators of their own neighborhood, of their own community, or against injustices by the state, against police brutality or things of this ilk. The entire argument the gentleman was making that I was talking to was, well, is this going to bring about justice? Is this going to bring about justice for the largest amount of people? Is this going to bring about justice for minority groups? Is this going to bring about justice? Yada, yada, yada. And I had to break it to him. Eventually I was like, look, man, I was like, you keep bringing up the word justice. I was like, number one, I don't believe in justice. I just don't believe that it's in the least bit possible. If there was any evidence that there was going to be justice, through the use of government in any situation, ever in the history. It would have been in the 240 years of the U.S.'s history. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And there's no evidence that we'll ever get to the idea that there's actually true justice for anybody. And, you know, maybe that's a pessimistic way of looking at it, but that's just the way I view it. And I just told him, I said, look, you're interested in justice, and I don't hold that against you, in the fact that I don't necessarily think that you think that way because you're bad or you know, anything like that. You just have a different idea. And my main interest is liberty, because that's going to be the best outcome for any of these groups. It gives them the opportunity within their own society, within their own community, to create their own form of justice, to create their own, you know, court system or police system, security system, whatever you want to call it. They're going to have their own systems in which that they are in control of, and that they can look to. And if they're being abused or they're being mistreated in any way, shape, or form, they have the power to get these people fired. Unlike today, when a police officer, you know, steps out and it causes the death of an Eric Garner or a Daniel Shaver, or they falsely, you know, arrests somebody under false pretenses, false accusations, that there's actually accountability under a system into which that community is controlling these devices of power. That community has the ultimate authority over these devices of quote unquote security or safety. If nothing else, that would, you know, limit the amount of abuses that are capable of taking place. And what I ended up watching this past week, actually, and I'm going to watch it again because I thought it was really good. It was well written. It was well done. It wasn't 100% accurate. I understand that. There are a couple of things within the movie that are a little out of place, or maybe were done in order to kind of solidify some of the emotion. But for the most part, it was probably about 85% accurate. And it was the movie When They See Us, and it was about the Central Park Five. I don't know if any of y'all remember that. I know some of you, well, I'm pretty sure some of you remember it. I know a couple do. But for the most part, like, what had happened was a group of kids hanging out in Central Park late at night. They were being young. They were being, some of them were being punks, some of them were beating up on people and throwing rocks at cars and doing, what kids do, being little juvenile delinquents, like most of us were at one point in time. And they ended up getting, most of them got picked up by the police. In the process of the whole situation, they were going to be sent to civil court, but in the process, there was a woman found that had been brutally raped and almost beaten to death. And 5 of these kids ended up getting convicted. They were coerced into confessions and convicted of raping and assaulting this woman. Now, in the history of the United States, there's very, very, very touchy race relations that are not going to be solved overnight, and they're not going to be solved through the use of government, given that a lot of the racial tensions were created by government. But there was definitely some amount of racial there was a racial element to this case. You're talking about 4 black boys and 1 half Hispanic, half black teenager. All of them were between the ages of 14 and 16. They all got between, I think it was 5 and 15 years. And the exoneration of their charges did not come through the system realizing that there was something wrong, or somebody within the system continuing an investigation saying, look, there was something wrong about the way this case went down. There was something wrong with these confessions. There was something like none of the physical evidence matched what you were getting these kids to confess to, yada, yada, yada. And unfortunately, what happens in this case was an upper middle class white woman was brutally raped and nearly murdered, and a bunch of minorities were imprisoned for large chunks of their life. And it wasn't until 2002 when the actual rapist, a serial rapist, came forward and confessed to the rape of this woman that all these charges were exonerated. It was not the state getting involved. It was not the state furthering an investigation and saying that there was something wrong. There was no review of this case. There was no appellate process. They were put up in front of the parole board, and because none of them would say, yeah, we actually committed this crime and we are remorseful of it, none of them were allowed to parole out. But why should they admit to something they didn't do? Even after a coerced confession, they do not have to continue to admit to it. And so I would encourage you to watch the movie. It's very good. It's a very good movie. If you've never seen the documentary, The Central Park 5, it's very good too. But the idea is, what makes you think that a system that still to this day, you're talking 17 years after the exoneration of these men and a court deciding, oh well, yeah, these charges are no longer valid, these convictions are no longer valid, we are going to evacuate these convictions and exonerate these boys. And still to this day, the lawsuit has just continued to be drug out. A state, the city of New York was eager. Within a year, these boys were locked up. And 17 years later, they can't get retribution for the mistakes that the state made. And not only can they not get retribution for the mistakes that the state made, but the DA's office and the police department are standing by the decisions and saying that all this proves is that serial rapist was hanging out with these boys, and that they still believe that these boys were involved, even though no evidence ever pointed in the direction of these boys being involved, and the police getting brutal and coercing these boys into confessions was not used against the confessions. And so you have to look at a system like that. That is not justice. There is no justice in that. These people will not be justifiably compensated for the loss of their life. They're not going to be justifiably compensated for the emotional scars or the PTSD that they suffer from the abuses that they dealt with in prison, from a bunch of young black boys, 14, 15 years old, getting beat up by grown-ass white men for raping a white woman. You're not going to get compensation for that. There's not going to be any retribution for that. There is no justice in this case. The best case scenario would have been one of liberty, one of freedom, into which these boys could have turned around and used their freedoms to say, I will not go with the police. I will not be subjected to this type of behavior by the police because a couple of kids got out of hand one night, and then now you want to start accusing every kid that was in the park that particular night. There were over 30 kids in the park that particular night. Just because a handful, 2 or 3, got a little out of hand and got a little rambunctious and caused some issues doesn't mean that 30 children should be going to civil court. And then to turn around and blame 5 of those children for a murder in which there's no physical evidence that places them anywhere near that victim at any point in time, that is not justice. And I promise you, within a system that perpetrates that type of injustice and these types of biases within its system and the protectionism of its own institutions at the disposal of citizens, because the state would have been perfectly happy had these boys rotted away in prison if it only made the state look good. That is not a system in which there was ever going to be justice. Fairness, which is usually what people mean by justice, is not going to occur. As my mama says, fairness is the devil. Because there's no such thing as fairness. Life is not fair. I'm being silly, but the fact of the fucking matter is nobody's going to be fair to you. Nobody's going to treat you fairly. Nobody's going to give you your just deserve. You have to go out there and you have to earn it every day, and you're lucky if you get it, if you do earn it. So justice is a fairy tale. Fairness is a fairy tale. These equality, equity, these things are fairy tales. They do not exist. You will not see them in your lifetime. I will not see them in my lifetime, because as long as there are those with the power to pick winners and losers, there's always going to be a loser, whether that loser is on the bottom side of the rung rightfully or not. So in some way, shape, or form, we have to learn to combat this idea of justice, this fairy tale that there will be justice, because it is not the reality of life. It is not the reality of the situation, and it has never been the reality of any country ruled over by a government. That's all I got for you today. I'm Tommy Salmons. Late.
You take on the intelligence community. They have 6 ways from Sunday of getting back at you.
I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. We had entire training courses. It reminds you of the glory of the American experiment.
You take on the intelligence community. They have 6 ways from Sunday of getting back at you.
I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. We had entire training courses. It reminds you of the glory of the American experiment.